Ladies and gentlemen, before we start this webinar, please make sure your audio volume is properly adjusted. So we know that you can hear us, please click on the hand icon on the control panel on the upper right side of your screen. Thank you. If you're experiencing any audio difficulties, please refer to the audio pane also located on the upper right side of your screen. The webinar will commence in approximately 1 minute. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. I'm Kevin Caron, Director of Capacity Buildings Programs at ACI World. And it's my pleasure to be your host for today's ACI webinar entitled Airside Safety and Operations During COVID-19. I'm sure COVID-19 is an acronym we'll be happy to hear the end of. I'm pleased to see with participants ranging from airports that are small, medium, and large, and representing all ACI regions. ACI Global Training has developed a series of webinars for members and more business partners on topics related to the current COVID-19 crisis, with a fourth webinar scheduled for the 30th of April on crisis communications, running a marathon. During the main presentation, you can write questions to the speakers by typing them into the questions pane located in the control panel on the upper right side of your screen. At the very end of the presentations, we'll be addressing some of your questions to the panelists. Please take note that the recorded version of this webinar will be available from the ACI website in about 24 hours. Airport operations teams have a reputation for providing safe, secure, and regulatory compliant operations, along with having the ability to turn on a dime to find solutions to some very complex problems. The current crisis has turned our airsides into, in some cases, long-term parking lots for everything ranging from Q400s, 78s, and even A380s, with the additional challenge of protecting our operations teams from getting infected by the COVID-19. For this webinar, not only will our presenters share their experience and how their airports have coped with the challenges surrounding reduced operations, but we will also hear about recovery plans in place to provide structure and guidance for airports towards that road to recovery. I do want to remind you that there is on the ACI World website extensive information on the COVID-19 crisis, including policy positions, advisory bulletins, press releases, free publications, so the business continuity and the emergency management handbook are both free on the website to members and world business partners. We do ask you to click on the link at the bottom of this screen, and we will send this in the thank you email just as a reminder of the services available to our membership and world business partners. Our distinguished speakers are today Michael Bélanger, Director Aviation Programs and Compliance at the Greater Toronto Airports Authority. He will provide an overview of how the pandemic impacted GTA's airside operations and the ongoing mitigation measures they have put in place to maintain safe operations. Our next speaker would be Thomas Roaming, Head of Operations, Control and Development at Aéroport de Genève, who will provide some insights into their organization and structure for the planning and ramp-up phase towards the recovery and resumption of operations in Geneva. Lastly, during the question and answer phase, David Gamper, ACI World's Director of Safety, Technical and Legal Affairs, will be available to provide ACI's perspective on any queries or concerns regarding the guidance and best practice sharing through the advisory bulletins and next steps following COVID-19. Michael, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin, for the kind introduction, and greetings to everyone on the webinar this morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present the Toronto Pearson COVID-19 experience from an airside safety and operations perspective. I hope everyone is keeping safe and healthy during these unprecedented times. To all of my airport colleagues and world business partners joining us today, I would also like to extend a thank you for all the efforts that you are keeping and undertaking to keep your airports open and serving the needs of your economies and surrounding communities. So this morning, again, I'll provide the perspective from Toronto Pearson, predominantly in three areas, but I'll start with some information in relation to Toronto Pearson, the activation of the contingency plans that we put in place for COVID-19, our temporary overflow parking plan, and some of the staffing composition and mitigation measures that we employed to facilitate the operation. So here's a brief overview of Toronto Pearson. Our passenger numbers at Toronto Pearson continue to drop significantly from the average of 138,000 per day you see on the screen to anywhere from 2,000 to 5,000 per day, depending on the day. The number of flights has also dropped significantly as well, from an average of over 1,200 per day to approximately 200 per day. Additionally, we anticipate only 9 passenger airlines to be operating over the next few weeks and months at Toronto Pearson, as compared to the approximately 67 that were operating just weeks ago. In terms of the layout of the airport, I'll briefly describe it because it is relevant in terms of how we put together our temporary overflow of aircraft parking plan. We operate 2 primary terminals, Terminal 1 and Terminal 3, with a third remote concourse referred to as the infield concourse, or the IFC. We are a 5-runway system with 3 east-west runways and 2 north-south runways, a centralized de-icing facility containing 6 pads on approximately 60 acres of land. And those are the main components of the airport that helped inform our parking plan. In terms of the activation of our contingency plans, there's 4 main plans that I'll speak to. However, there are additional plans that we did lever, but these are the 4 primary ones that informed our airside response and the associated facilitation of safe airside operations. First, I'll start with our communicable disease plan, and this has been the heart and the core of our response to COVID-19. This plan has been in play for quite some time, but really been informed from our lessons learned from our experience in Toronto in the SARS experience in 2003, to establish, define, and maintain meaningful relationships with our government health agencies and define control procedures during a period of a pandemic. These relationships with our health agencies have been able to mature over the years via annual tabletop exercise on the specific plan with the various government agencies to undertake continuous improvement opportunities and really help foster those meaningful relationships so that the planning activities can commence in anticipation of an escalation of a plan, which for our case it did. But the real magic that's come from this plan is the specific operational checklists that have been developed over time that are very specific and tailored for this specific business units within our company to undertake in relation to the pandemic. And one very brief example is our facility stores group, which is responsible for all of the parts and equipment to keep the airport running. But we also keep a stock of personal protective equipment that they have specific procedures on the dispensation of that equipment in these type of events. Our facility control measures and evacuation plan. This plan was adapted from its primary applicability, which is really for evacuation during a fire or some sort of threat on a facility. But it really does define the utilization of our backup facilities for our core airside operations, such as our Integrated Operations Control Center and our Apron Management Unit, which operates in a tower type facility for advisory air traffic services. Our alternate facility for the IOCC, our Integrated Operations Center, was activated almost immediately after the Canadian border restrictions were announced on Wednesday, March the 18th. However, preparations had started well in advance of this. Our alternate facility for our Apron Management Unit, which offers one of our first learnings, our backup facility for that service is our control tower for our air navigation service provider operated by Nav Canada. Their quarantine measures and protection of their employees did call for the restriction and prohibition of any non-Nav Canada employees to access their facilities. So we had to establish a backup to our backup plan very quickly. This was recognized very early, but again, it was due to the relationship that we do have with our air navigation service provider, which enabled quick and active response to that, ultimately resulting in a secondary backup facility being established in our central de-icing facility, which shares much of the same equipment that's used by our Apron Management Unit. In relation to the aircraft staging and parking plan, I will speak to this a little bit later, but the plan was originally developed to accommodate two primary scenarios: very short-term weather-related events like a lightning event, and or the bankruptcy of a primary air carrier operation at the airport. So very short-term and or very static in terms of its planning assumptions, which I'll speak to a little bit later. Our business continuity plan acts as our baseline document with many high-level scenarios outlined traditionally in relation to the loss of major infrastructure such as a runway or a terminal facility, a baggage system, or the provision of air navigation services. Minimum levels of service and recovery times are outlined to facilitate the resumption of normal operations and re-engage normal processes, albeit the core assumption that has traditionally been applied to the business continuity planning processes is that our demand will always exceed our ability to provide supply or capacity, whereas the COVID-19 experience has presented the exact opposite of this planning assumption. Initial steps taken to date to manage some of the business continuity activities, like many other airports, has been the right sizing or consolidation of facilities, including the closure of our infield concourse, consolidation of aircraft and baggage operations into limited operations within the terminals. We're still operating both of the terminals, but in a much reduced capacity, whether it be on the airside in terms of gates or inside the building in terms of security points, check-in facilities, and or baggage facilities. In relation to our temporary overflow of aircraft parking plan, this was you'll see a picture here on the left. This is a picture from our central de-icing facility taken towards the end of March. Normally towards the end of March in Toronto, it is either a very sunny day like in the picture, or it could be a snowstorm with multiple centimeters and ice. So our pre-established contingency plan did require amendment from a very static approach to long-term parking to be flexed and to be flexible and adapt to dynamic considerations that were being presented from the COVID-19 planning assumptions. The requests from the airlines started for additional parking really in relation to short term being less than 48 hours, needing a place to put a plane for a little bit of time, upward, and greater than 48 hours up to 6 or 7 months. And the information at the onset of the decline in traffic was very volatile, and it made it very difficult to establish planning parameters around it. But there was great work done by our operations team through the establishment of a multidisciplinary internal working group set up to reformulate the plan and facilitate safe and continued operations. We never had an exact number, but the request for parking did exceed 100 aircraft at a particular time, and the variables for consideration were far different than our previous planning assumptions, in that we had to keep the airport open and operating at the onset very close to our normal operating capacities. With the reduced flights, we still had the requirement to have the contact stands available for passenger flights. The planning assumptions on the reduction in traffic were changing daily, if not hourly, at certain times, with additional border restrictions being announced, and subsequently would inform our approach to the parking plan. As the traffic continued, as we continued to get line of sight to the traffic reductions, it gave us more flexibility to park airplanes on our terminal contact stands to mitigate the requirement to park on, say, a runway facility or a taxiway as required. The information on the parking requirements, as I mentioned, fluctuated frequently, and the requirements to inform a parking plan that was robust and flexible to accommodate up to, we didn't know how long this was going to be, we were going to be in this for, but multiple months. So we have summer construction activities identified on one of our primary north-south runways, where the other north-south runway that we have is identified as a parking area, so we couldn't park there to protect for the summer construction activities. There were requests for idle runs and ongoing maintenance activities for the aircraft, being able to hot swap or utilize the aircraft within the operation to keep them flying as much as they possibly could and just rotate them around. We had to keep our de-icing facility available for winter operations, because we were still in our winter operations mode, and ultimately moving into our convective weather season through the spring and the summer, which we use that facility to stage aircraft. We also had to think about our ability to move an aircraft in the event of a ground handler no longer being available to move those airplanes. So again, we levered many of our relationships. We have great relationships with our ground service providers from our Airside ground operations team. They did fantastic work to facilitate the ongoing assumptions that supported the development of our plan. Right now, we're parking anywhere between 40 and 50 airplanes at any one time. We've been able to accommodate them all on existing and established contact stands and or existing center lines, as you see here in our central de-icing facility, which really makes it the ability to move the airplanes around. It gives us that agility to do so at the request of the airlines. And finally, in relation to this, we established a parking committee, both internally and at the onset. We reached out to our airport partners through our relationships pre-established, whether it be through our ACI connections on our standing committee of safety and technical affairs, or just our relationships in general from being in the Canadian airport sphere. So reaching out to our colleagues at Vancouver Airport, Montreal, and Calgary, the four referred to as the four major airports in Canada. This contact was made almost immediately and led to the formation of a national planning committee with the four major airports. So thank you to our friends in Vancouver for taking the lead to form that committee. And it's been very effective, meeting daily at the onset to twice a week. And now I believe they're meeting once a week, just to keep track of all the requests, because a lot of the requests that came in initially, the same request would be sent to multiple airports, just trying to acquire parking space. But we are seeing a reduction in the number of aircraft at our airport seeking more hospitable environment for long-term parking. We also leverage the relationships of our surrounding network of 11 smaller regional airports around Toronto to ascertain their capabilities at the onset to accommodate any aircraft that we weren't able to. So again, leveraging those relationships. Many of the plan considerations that we undertook are outlined on the slide here. It is a very busy slide, but we did publish a directive to our air operators that outlined many of the restrictions involved in and requirements to park their aircraft at the airport. We did take a position on how we would position the aircraft. We could park more aircraft if we were creative in parking and didn't park them on established lines. We refer to it as densified parking versus non-densified, and we did choose to predominantly park aircraft nose to tail where we could, or on an existing stand, primarily due to the meteorological conditions that we would anticipate at this time of year. Very high winds, potential for snowstorms. We didn't want the possibility of aircraft to weather vane. Distinguishing between short and long-term parking was a very valuable way to separate the aircraft to enable the movement of the short-term ones. They were in for a couple of days and they would leave, versus the long-term ones we could park in an area and leave them there and not have to worry about moving them around at the frequency that may be expected otherwise. Certainly an increase in the pavement inspections. Our airside safety team doing multiple inspections daily on the pavement conditions, and also to facilitate the run-up requirements that were provided to us. I believe it was once every 7 days to undertake a run-up. Frequent coordination activities, again, leveraging those relationships. An important component here was the tracking and billing requirements for the aircraft. And there's a number of other things here. One of the things that stood out was wildlife monitoring. Wildlife seemed to take an interest in our aircraft when they were parked. Finally, in terms of staffing composition and mitigation measures, we did maintain all of our critical airside services and inspections, primarily in relation to separating people through physical distancing, the reduction of staff where possible. One example is we would normally have 2 airside maintenance crews on during a day shift and 1 on in the evening shift, where we decided to protect one of them by keeping them away from the airport. So if one crew was compromised from COVID-19, we would still have another crew available to keep the operation going. All of our fire and emergency services staff were maintained, and our de-icing operations staff, we have a seasonal model where we have a large component of seasonal staff that we were able to flex the operation to deliver what we needed to. And we had a really favorable weather scenario in March, which really we could keep a lot of people at home, which the remote working option for many was employed. Many of our departments have 90 plus to 100% of their staff working from home, but in our operations, we're about 60% working remotely and 40% on site. I think this is my second last slide. One of the things that was really able to help us separate our operations is many of our operational facilities are physically separate. So our operations center, our airfield maintenance, our apron tower, our fire halls, our airside busing, de-icing operations, baggage, and our airfield electrical centers, they are all separate facilities. So it really helped enable the principle of separation. And then the reduction of staff on site to facilitate the operation was also beneficial, and working remotely where able was also beneficial. So again, lessons learned to summarize, the assumption that demand is always greater than supply is really challenged the business continuity and operational continuity planning. We have a great group that undertakes that, and the plans that we had really enabled us to be successful, primarily in relation to the communicable disease plan and our pandemic plan. Having the frameworks flexible and agile enough to respond to the various things that arise during the course of a major event like this has really enabled our management staff and frontline workers to be flexible and not bound by very specific things to follow. And finally, and most importantly, our success during our COVID-19 response would not have been possible without the relationships that we have, whether it be with the airlines, the ground service providers, our air navigation service provider, our government agencies and health agencies. The number of relationships and calls that happen every day keep us up to speed and able to keep our people safe, our passengers safe, and the operations running to enable the support groups such as finance, human resources, and communications to do the valuable work that they're doing to enable the response. and help the other operational groups, the non-operational, say the functional groups, to prepare the strategy for recovery. And on that note, I'll conclude my slides this morning with here's my contact information. One thing we've been using as a rally point is the Pearson Strong hashtag, which we first heard from our new CEO, Deborah Flint, who's been fantastic through this, and some very significant contributions from my peers. So thank you, everybody, for your time this morning, and that'll conclude my slides for this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and very interesting presentation. And I'm sure Brett Patterson out in Vancouver, who's listening, is quite happy that you definitely made reference to, again, the community of airports and how that works. So we have a quick poll. We'll ask you, we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer it. So the question is really, is your airport currently working on a recovery plan? So we'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that, and we'll turn on to our next speaker after that.
Yeah, we're certainly working on a recovery plan. I think the primary things we're considering right now is what type of airport are we going to be when we resume normal operations. So we have a number of active groups in the organization answering a number of strategic questions to really establish what and reset our strategy on the resumption of, we can call it normal operations or irregular operations. I think the world's going to be different when we resume operations. So really trying to take into consideration as many different planning parameters that we can on what we think the world will look like even 6 months from now, never mind 6 years from now. So short answer is yes, we have a number of planning activities underway to resume normal operations.
Super, thanks very much, Michael. Thomas, we'll turn it over to you, please, for a perspective of what's happening in Geneva.
Good day, everybody. I hope you can see on the screen some slides at this point in time. My name is Thomas Romig. I'm head of Ops, Control and Development for Geneva Airport. And my intent over the next few slides here is to give you an overview of what we've done in Geneva for our organization and planning, I'd say, of our overall system related to COVID-19, as well as provide you with a little bit of input on the ramp up of operations, where we're going and how we're planning things here. So to start with, just to go straight into a little overview of Geneva Airport, for your information, for those of you who aren't familiar with our environment, we are a single runway operation in Switzerland, the second airport in Switzerland, operating just under 18 million passengers last year, with a current operation, well, what used to be a current operation on our runway of 40 movements per hour, and a distribution, I guess, of airlines, market share of airlines, mainly being with EasyJet, who's our main operator in terms of passengers, with Swiss, the national airline, being our second operator, with a significant portion of passengers also, and then a number of others. We've had some regular growth over the years, but obviously now the situation has all changed. And as you can see, the last image on the right-hand side of the slides, our destinations are primarily European-based. We're a point-to-point operation, with a fairly good network of destinations, 149 destinations across the world. So what's happened in Geneva? These are the interesting figures. As you can see from the beginning of the year, the first graph at the top is movement, and the second graph at the bottom is passengers. comparison 2019, 2020. We are now into week 16 or week 17, and we have a seriously reduced operation going on here. We have our passenger traffic down by 98%, our movements down by about 95%. And as you can see, even on the graph with the passengers, you can barely even capture the amount of passengers that we have in those bars. They're
Sorry,
down
Thomas.
to,
Can we
yes.
just maximize your screen? If you go down to the bottom right, all the way in the bottom right.
It should be maximized already.
Go down, yeah, right there. Try that.
It was
We're just having some issue.
Sorry, well then, let me try and do that differently. Is that better?
There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I had the wrong monitor. I have two monitors. The wrong one was being shown.
That happens. No worries.
So now we've dealt with the technical difficulties. I'll jump right back into the COVID difficulties and come to how we've explained or broken down this situation for us here in Geneva. So what happened, obviously, we went through a phase of reduction of traffic, which was very significant, with major impacts from that perspective. We dealt with aircraft parking, as Michael just explained to us. We dealt with all of the phases of reduction of traffic, asking staff to leave the airport, and pretty much ending up with a completely empty infrastructure. So very quickly, we broke down the problem into what we called sub-issues or sub-domains. We have taken the approach of looking at the airport system as a global, as an overall system. So not just looking at the airside operations or looking at the, I'd say the more operational aspects of the airport, but really looking at the overall economic aspects, as well as the commercial aspects, as well as the HR, comms, and so on. So we've broken down our problem overall, the COVID-19 crisis, into three different main pillars, excuse me. First one being the operability, the general operability of the airport system. The second one being the planning and ramp up, which is necessary. And a third one being the economic sustainability of not just the airport company itself, but equally of the aviation system in Switzerland, as obviously we're not the only ones as an airport impacted by this situation. The airline operators or aircraft operators, as well as a lot of the other stakeholders, including ground handlers, are significantly impacted by this current situation. And therefore, we really have to be able to manage that that impact on a system-wide approach, and not just looking at ourselves as an airport company. We've identified obviously a number of transverse domains, communications being the first one. I've been dealing with this COVID situation since mid-January in Switzerland here. And as I was explaining in the beginning of the situation, this was primarily a communications exercise where we were trying to communicate clear and transparent information internally and externally on the current situation. And it's continued to be one of the main issues, is dealing with communications and making sure we've got clear messages which are established on the current situation. Resources being a very important point. Michael covered it also in his presentation a few minutes ago, making sure that we have the right resources on site and available for sustaining the current operation, as well as making sure that we have resources which are kept safe, is obviously one of our key points. And then we have the logistics, infrastructure, and technology as an individual point, which supports obviously the operability of the airport system, the planning and ramp up, and the economic sustainability. So in order to deal with these three different areas, we've then split the responsibilities down into three different pillars. So we have our airport operations center, as we call it, the APOC, and the operations units, so airports and partners or airport stakeholders, who are all participating in running the daily operations. We still have an active operation going on, even though we're down to somewhere between 70 to 150, or some days 300 passengers, and a handful of movements. We still have to run the airports as normal, even in this very degraded situation. We had in place already since mid-January a COVID task force, which was running the management of the main issues related to COVID from the beginning, and went through the phase of what I call the crash and burn phase, which was really coming down from normal operations to a stabilized hibernation type of phase. And from that, we've now spun up into a planning and ramp up operation. I'll talk to that a little bit more as we go forwards. The main role, or one of the main roles of the COVID task force, has been to ensure a transverse coordination with all the affected stakeholders through the airport system. And again, not just looking at the airside ops, but looking at the terminal operations, looking at all the concessionaires in the terminal, and looking really at the airport as an overall system. And finally, we have our economic sustainability pillar, which where we developed a specific task force internal to the airport company to really look at the specific issues around sustainability, financial or economic sustainability. So I'm going to talk more about the operations side of the task force, the ops task force. This is where my focus is for the moment. We've got obviously a number of external coordinations which are established, both on a national level as well as on a state level. And one of the key coordinations we have is with the public health authorities. So that's been very important since early in this crisis to have current and up-to-date information from the public health authorities. Luckily in Switzerland, we have a fairly proactive network which is already in place with the public health authorities and the aviation players through the national level aviation COVID task force. So that provides us with some very clear information in terms of what needs to be done and what guidelines we need to apply, what policies are being developed. At the same time, we have our local level coordination, which is extremely important, with a specific stakeholders task force which was established. Early on in the situation, we had various coordinations with individuals, and fairly rapidly through the month of February, we decided to establish a local level stakeholder task force, which in the beginning met several times a week and is now meeting once a week, to ensure that all of the stakeholders, the airport operating stakeholders, are up to date on the current information, know what the plans are, know what the current issues are, and can report back to us as the airport operator their issues and where the problems are that they may be faced with. One of the key aspects coming out of our planning process is actually taking our planning and ramp up process, which is run by the planning cell within our COVID task force, taking it out with the operational plans and putting it into operational delivery, and then allowing the operational delivery to stabilize this operation, put it into the APOC. So basically what we've done is put together a feedback loop and a continuous improvement type of process, where we have a planning cell within our overall COVID task force, which coordinates with all of the different stakeholders across the airport system, internal and external to the airport company, establishes the operational plan, so to speak, which may be changes to the infrastructure when we talk about social distancing areas, or the installation of plexiglass or various other types of devices within the terminal. When we look at the procedures which need to be changed in terms of boarding or deboarding of aircraft, again for social distancing reasons, changes to various systems, changes to procedures, all of these aspects are dealt with by this planning cell, which ensures the coordination in the development of the plan. In parallel to this, they're developing or we're developing the verifications on infrastructure, on systems, on operations through what we're calling mini ORATs to ensure that we come back into operation with, after everything has been verified and everything has been checked from an operational readiness perspective, to render to the daily operations a system which works. So these plans are then transferred to the operations delivery cell within our COVID task force. The operations delivery cell is made up of all of the different key operation stakeholders within our airport company, as well as ensures coordination with the main stakeholders on the airport, aircraft operators and ground handlers in particular, as well as ANSP. This team then takes the plan as has been established by the planning cell and renders it operational, stabilizes it, and at the same time ensures the operability of the airport system through the implementation of the ORATs, which are then done either by individual units or by the ops delivery cell. And finally, once the operation is stabilized and things are working correctly, then it's handed over to the Airport Operations Center to take over the responsibility for running it as daily operations. And this process we've been through already a number of times in the reduction phase, and we're going through the same type of process, or we're planning the same type of process for the uptake phase, which we're looking at getting into in the next few weeks, hopefully. Obviously, that's one of the big issues, is knowing when things are going to start moving in terms of traffic. So one of the key aspects of our COVID task force is having what I've called a data science cell within our task force, where we have our ops performance as well as our aircraft or airline marketing team and a number of other individuals participating to provide us with the most up-to-date data in terms of what's currently going on. And here you just have one of the dashboards which is used to monitor the current traffic on the airport. And we have also been establishing a number of forecasts and scenarios, as you can see in the lower part of the slide, with some projections, different scenarios which we've established to give us a view of where we may be going based on the most recent and available information, both from aircraft operators as well as what's been established by some of the industry associations and various consulting groups who are currently working fairly hard to be able to establish some figures, or at least give some trends and ideas of where the traffic may be going and when things might be kicking off again. The idea of having these scenarios isn't necessarily to say, well, we will have exactly this going on. It's to look forwards a little bit and to start giving us an idea of where our traffic may be taking us and where we might end up at the end of the year, or as a minimum in the next 3 to 4 months, what the progression may be, so that we can ensure to match the estimations in terms of physical resources and human resources to these different scenarios. So a lot of our planning process is really related to these scenarios that we're developing. Finally, I just wanted to leave you with this quick image of the overall plan. This is really just a synopsis of a much more detailed document, which we have a Gantt chart, which has all different processes which are under review and all the different infrastructures which have been developed and worked on. But basically, we went through this phase of crisis management, entry into hibernation. As you can see, we're now in what we could consider to be business continuity and airport system ramp-up planning, and then shortly, at some point, we'll be getting into airport system operational management, That phase of when we get back into operational management, that means when traffic starts moving again, obviously right now is very, very unclear, as one of the key problems that we're faced with is getting timely information from aircraft operators and making sure actually that or helping the passengers, who are the people who are going to be buying tickets to fly in the end, are reassured as they come into the airports and feel that they are safe in the environment. So that's going to be the big challenge that we're going to be faced with moving forwards. The various steps within this planning process here, you can see here, with finally the end part being the implementation of changes to the procedures, infrastructures, and systems, the operational readiness, and finally entry into operation sometime in May, if all goes well. Our national authorities have decided that as of the 11th of May, we'll go to phase 2 of deconfinement, which means that people will be allowed to move around a little bit more, and we'll have schools opening again here in Switzerland, which will already start a little bit more mobility. So that's what I wanted to explain today, and you have my email here, contact information. Would be happy to discuss further. I think we've got some extra time now for a few questions, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen.
Perfect, Thomas. Thanks very much. Again, excellent presentation. We'll just roll one more polling question, Kayla, if we could, just before we go to the question period. So we'll just let the participants answer that, and then we'll give you a bit of time to think about it. Okay, I think we can close the poll, and we'll get into the question period. All right, I guess the first question, well, actually, somebody's looking a little bit into the future. David, we can put it to you. Somebody was asking about the new reporting format. You know, there's a requirement for states to adopt that in November, the global reporting format. Can you sort of give some insights as to your thoughts on that and what work is being done with ICAO towards that? Is it still going to be required for November? Or is there, I believe, of course, the question would be an ACI position on that.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Kevin. Yes, we've been concerned about this because it's already been indicated from some airports that they think there may be problems as a result of the COVID-19 crisis in being ready in time. And of course, airlines too will be pushed to do that, to be ready in time when some of their staff are not available, who would have been needed to be trained. The pilots, of course, and also dispatchers. But also on the airport side, we have been working very hard to ensure that a good training course is available for airport staff. It's been available for, I think, nearly a year now. And we've also been working with airports. But we became aware that this might not be an easy task. And so several airports approached us to ask ICAO to defer the implementation date from November this year, and probably by a year. So we checked on that with a lot of airports that are represented on our committee, Safety and Technical Committee, and the unanimous view came back that the applicability date should be deferred. So we've now just written, in fact, yesterday to ICAO to ask for a deferment until 1st of October 2021. And that would allow more time for airport operators to do the implementation in a more coordinated way, and to do all the training of staff that they need to do, the IT system modifications that they may need to do, and so on, during a time when at the moment, they don't have all the staff available. Many staff have been laid off. And we can ensure then that the industry should be ready, properly ready, everyone will be ready. We don't think it's a decrease in safety because it's simply delaying a safety benefit that we could expect from this change. And we think an immature transition wouldn't be a good thing. Much better to wait until everyone's ready. So if that answers the question.
I will wait to see if they come back, but that's a good answer, David, I think. Maybe up to the panel, what measures, procedures have airports developed to maintain social distancing of the 1.5 to 2 meters on the airside? Michael, I think you touched upon that, what GTA was doing. I think also Thomas did. Could you elaborate a little bit on your experiences with that? Just need you gentlemen to unmute your microphones if you want to comment.
Hi, thanks, Kevin. I think from an airside operations perspective, we've done a couple of things. First, in relation to our airside busing operations at the onset, normally picture yourself in a very busy and crammed bus. We did substantially reduce the number of passengers that we would allow onto a bus. We use co-buses in Toronto, which has a physical separation of the driver from the passengers. So we directed our drivers to stay in the cab of the vehicle. Also, to facilitate a smoother flow through our customs facilities in the terminals, we did hold a number of aircraft off the gates to enable less passengers to be in the customs facility at any one time. And I think finally, from an airside perspective, for driving in vehicles, we've limited one driver per vehicle, and we've had some escalated oversight from our airside safety officer group just to ensure that folks are abiding by that, and also the use of PPE when transiting our screening points into the airside or into the restricted area of the terminals.
And maybe just a few words.
Sure, Thomas, go ahead.
To build on what Michael just explained, we very many of the measures we've implemented in Geneva are the same. Reduction in capacity in the buses has actually been one of the measures that we've found to be quite useful. And what I've seen actually a few pictures from other airports who have actually implemented markings in buses on the ground to show where separations should be, or where people should be, or how people should be separated within the vehicles. One of the procedures we changed for our operation here was the deboarding operation, with a slowed down deboarding, if you like, where the aircraft operator or the handling agent would reduce the number of people exiting the aircraft at one point in time. So groups of 5 would be allowed to leave, allowing people to be able to walk at social distances between them as they enter the terminal infrastructures. Obviously, this has significant impacts on the passenger flows, and in particular on turnaround times for aircraft. So that's an issue that we have to deal with. We actually recently had an exchange with the Safety Technical Standing Committee members, the ACI group, on this point of social distancing. And what we found is that across the world, there's variations in the interpretation of social distancing, or at least the distance required, which range between 1 meter or 3 feet up until 2 meters or 6 feet, depending on where you are. And we found even in neighboring countries, to take the example of Switzerland and Italy, we have 1 meter applied on one side of the Alps and 2 meters applied here in Switzerland. So it's it's a bit of a moving target. It would be nice to have some harmonized approach related to that at some point.
Okay, thanks very much. There was one question, I guess David and I can answer, about a recovery plan from ACI. We are working on guidance. So what I failed to mention is Thomas is the vice chair of the Safety Standing Committee at ACI World, and Michael Belanger is also a member at large of that committee, with David being the secretary. So there is guidance material. ACI Europe has actually worked on a really good document. They're still doing some research. But ACI will be providing to the membership some policies and best practices related to recovery. We're looking to have that by mid-May, so stay tuned for that. I'll go on to the next question here about.
Kevin,
sorry,
maybe Kevin, I can just add something.
Go ahead, David.
Since you were talking about what ACI has already produced, ACI World has already published an Airside Safety and Operations Advisory Bulletin on the 3rd of April. And we did that on the basis of a short survey of the members of the committee that was done in the last week of March. So in fact, that already does respond and has quite a lot of information about parking. Also covers airside operations teams and how to ensure less mixing of teams and so on. And also cargo operations, and also talking about coordination with key external stakeholders. So that one we sent out quite early, and we're just working on another one now with some more information on aircraft parking. You may come to a question on aircraft parking, so I won't talk about that yet.
Thanks, David. Excellent addition. One of the other questions we have here is several, so I'm going to try and get through them. RF category, has there been any talk of lowering the cap for the airport to reduce staff due to reduced operations? I don't know, Thomas or roaming, Thomas or Michael, sorry, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, so maybe in Geneva, we looked at that. The problem is that we are maintaining a significant number of cargo operations and cargo operations with wide-body aircraft. So the possibilities to reduce our RF category was a little bit limited. What we did do, though, is change the rostering of the RFF staff in order to do, as Michael mentioned in his presentation, to ensure that we didn't have teams that were crossing each other in the fire hall. And at one point we actually had a couple of guys who got sick, caught the virus in one of the teams, so had to put the whole team in quarantine for a couple of weeks. So it is something which can be considered, but obviously needs to be looked at based on the current sustained operation within the airport.
Super, thanks, Thomas. Michael, do you want anything to add on that?
Just very briefly, to answer the question, we haven't considered any reductions in our ARF service for many of the reasons that Thomas just outlined. But I think, you know, as we start the business continuity strategy development, that'll certainly be a discussion point in terms of what the fire service and every other service at the airport looks like in terms of level of service when we return to operations.
Thanks, Michael. One question related to, was directed a little to Thomas, but I think Michael could answer it too. What's been your experience working with the health authorities? So either, I guess, Health Canada over in Toronto and the Swiss equivalent related to these planning operations?
So from our side, it's been a pretty positive experience, I'd say. We've had, as I mentioned in my talk, we have a network which is already pre-established, which has been running for several years, and we've actually been within this network of it's the aviation health network, I guess you would call it here in Switzerland, which coordinates the application of pandemic plans across the aviation system. So with the aircraft operators, with the airports involved in these planning activities. And so given the network which was already established, and as Michael mentioned, is one of his lessons learned, the pre-established relationships being extremely important. We were lucky to have a scenario in which we have pre-established relationships which we were able to leverage and build upon to make sure that the situation here was as easy as possible to manage. So we've been very lucky to have a good relation and good information, good level of exchange. I know that in other places it's not always the case, and that's probably a bit of a case by case type of situation.
In the case for Toronto, Kevin, as I mentioned in the presentation, that pre-established relationship that we have with Public Health Canada and even the local and provincial health agencies was key to our response. Our operational continuity and emergency management team, led by my peer Sue Parrott, has been instrumental in the response that we've had. So the relationship's been great, and even our public health relationship, they've done a number of individual briefings for various operational units to address various concerns that have arisen throughout the course of the COVID-19 experience. So having that relationship and that pre-established network has been key to the response that we've had so far. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I think we'll go over just a minute or two. There's a lot of great questions coming in. I'll squeeze in one last question before we wrap up. Have you, either at Toronto or Geneva, have you seen any damage as far as to the pavement or the concrete due to aircraft being parked for a long period of time? I think you made reference additional inspections. I don't know if either of you want to touch on that a little bit more.
Certainly in Toronto, one of the primary areas we parked aircraft in was an older area of apron that was not in the best condition to begin with. So a lot of the mitigation activities that were put in place before parking the aircraft there were undertaken, but we haven't seen any material degradation in the surfaces since they've been parked there. It's only been a couple of weeks for us, but we've also removed any aircraft from our taxiway surfaces to facilitate our summer construction activities, and any of the remaining aircraft are at our central de-icing facility. They're all parked on concrete. We haven't seen any material degradation in any surfaces there yet, but it's something that we're monitoring with increased frequency of inspections from our airside safety officers, but it's definitely one of the primary considerations in the plan.
And in Geneva, we have very much a similar situation. We have about 45 aircraft on ground currently, which varies a little bit, but we have a pretty much all concrete installation in Geneva. So the bearing or the degradation to those surfaces has been very minimal. We've increased the number of inspections, daily rounds around all of the aircraft, or multiple times per day, to ensure that we don't have any degradation to the surfaces. One thing we have seen though is leaks, fuel leaks and hydraulic leaks on aircraft, and after discussion with some of the aircraft engineers, we found that there are actually some parts on aircraft that when they don't fly, when they're not operating or aren't powered often enough, they tend to start leaking. So we went through a period where we had aircraft maintenance running around looking at all different parts to make sure that leaks would not occur. That then obviously created issues for fuel on pavement and so on. But otherwise, there hasn't been any real degradation, though.
Kevin, if I could just one final comment on that, not in relation to pavement degradation, but one of the interesting things that we've experienced with the parking of aircraft and having them in a static position for a period of time is the promulgation of wildlife, nesting birds and raccoons in particular. It's springtime here, so the weather's starting to change. So they're taking advantage of spaces to establish habitats. So certainly the increased reliance on our wildlife control officers has been something that wasn't part of our original planning assumptions. So that's a lesson learned there. Thanks.
Same for us, interestingly, Michael.
Yeah. May I just mention something as well?
Yes, quite quickly, David, please.
I will be quick, yes. I was mentioning earlier that ACI is ready to send out a new advisory bulletin actually tomorrow on mitigating the risks of overflow aircraft parking. And that includes a kind of template for safety risk assessment for all the different issues that can arise. And that includes aircraft collisions during towing. So we've also got a lot of best practices for aircraft, special aircraft parking arrangements. And we've got some material from from aircraft manufacturers as well, especially a new leaflet from Airbus, which is quite interesting because it talks about possibilities for lightening the aircraft and also for tethering it with concrete blocks if you can do that, if your airline is able to do that, which may then reduce the damage to asphalt pavement if you have asphalt pavement where you have to park the aircraft. Obviously, first choice is concrete. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks very much, David. So ladies and gentlemen, again, apologies for running a bit over, but again, there were some really good questions and we had, I think, a very good panel with our three speakers. We're at the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank Michael Belanger from Toronto, Thomas Roaming from Geneva, and my good and one of the longest serving ACI employees, David Gamper, along with thanking my team, Kaylee and Nadia, who were in master control. I'd also like to invite you to fill out the exit survey as we value your comments and feedback. Additionally, ACI will be sending you a survey to find out what other topics you'd like to have discussed in this free webinar series. Again, I'd like to thank everyone, and remember, we're all in this together. Wishing you a very good day or evening. Thank you.